Sunderland native Paul Swinney, Head of Policy and Research at the Centre for Cities. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
Good afternoon.
This announcement by Nissan that it was going to build its new models in Japan, what was your reaction?
Well, I would say it wasn't a huge surprise. I mean, I know that there'd been a deal done with the UK government. Perhaps that was a bit of a surprise when that deal was struck around about 2 years ago. But certainly it's clear that, one of the benefits of Nissan being based in the UK and being based in Sunderland is having access to the European market. I know that's not the only reason why they decide to change their decision. But of course, as UK changes the relationship with Europe, that's going to have an impact on how attractive UK cities are to this type of investment, and it will alter investment decisions in the future.
Yeah, you mentioned what was, in effect, a secret deal, right? Back in 2016, the UK government offering up to £80 million to Nissan to help extend and renovate the plant in Sunderland, a sweetener, if you will, to make sure that the Japanese automaker remains in the UK. Your thoughts on this coming out at this time?
Well, it was clear that a deal had been struck, and I was certainly sure that the government didn't make a big thing about it at the time and didn't sort of divulge the details. It's interesting to see that now the details do come out. But again, I think, if we're thinking that, a company such as Nissan investing in a city like Sunderland is there because of access to the single market, there must have been some sort of deal put in place. Now, I think there's a challenge here for Sunderland and perhaps other places in the north of England that attract this type of investment, where it creates lots of jobs, but potentially they're not that well-paid jobs relative to other jobs, certainly in London, in the south of England, that could move elsewhere in the world. These places need to move on, I think, from companies where they have to keep on offering sweeteners and have to keep on offering deals every couple of years. And that's a big challenge, I think, in or out of Europe or in or out of the EU. A place like Sunderland has to be able to reinvent its economy, attracting new industries that are going to create new jobs rather than being on the precipice of another closure that will be the decline of the car factory and the way it struggled in light of the decline of the shipyards and mines that it went through the closures of the 1970s, 80s and 1990s.
Paul, before we went on air, we were researching, we read interviews with like a floor manager who said if he had to do it all over again, he would still vote for Brexit. Is that anecdotal?
Well, I think the only way we'll really know the answer to that is if there was a second referendum and we could see people go to the polls. I certainly think there may well have been a degree of bravado at the time where some of the things that we heard were people saying that, Nissan would never leave. And I must stress within this that Nissan are not leaving Sunderland. They've just changed one of their investment decisions. But they were suggesting that actually Nissan's position wouldn't change whether Sunderland was in or out of the EU. Clearly, that's been a factor in their decision to move the X-Trail production. And we'd have to ask the people themselves whether now there's been a change in action or there's actually been a display of action by Nissan. Those actions have been met with the words that came before as to whether they would change their voting preferences now. It may well be the case that they wouldn't. Some of the perceived benefits that they see of not being in the EU may well outweigh the loss of jobs. I think for Sunderland's economy, it certainly would be a bad thing if Nissan would start to wind down its activities in the city, given that it's such a large employer and that the city is so dependent on it currently.
Yeah, the city over-dependent, and you mentioned the need to diversify the economy. Do you think the government right now has a plan when it comes to that?
Well, I think the big irony of the Brexit vote was that a lot of places in England certainly sounded a large alarm bell to say we're not satisfied with how life is at the moment. And yet, the last 2.5 years, all we've seen after this big alarm bell was called was just infighting behind me in Westminster between politicians jostling for position, rather than setting out any clear domestic policy and any clear domestic strategy about how we actually were going to improve the economies of these places. Now, like I said, in or out of the EU, the challenges that these faces place don't fundamentally change. They need to attract in more businesses, they need to attract in more high-skilled jobs. That's what they lack at the moment. And there are a number of reasons for that. And the government needs to set out a very clear plan about how they can sort of change the attractiveness of these places to attract in such businesses through skills policies, through transport policies and other policies. But there hasn't really been any of that, nothing of any substance, which means that Sunderland's ability to attract in investment today UK, or say a place like Wakefield or Doncaster, other places in the north of England, their ability to attract in that type of investment today is no better than what it was 2.5 years ago. And in fact, some will argue that not being in the EU will actually make it even worse.
So, Paul Swinney, what are the chances after this announcement by Nissan of a no-deal Brexit? Are they better, worse, or should we just discard rational thinking when it comes to what's to come over the next 2 months?
Well, certainly, I think there's been so much change in politics here over the last 2.5 years. It's very difficult to predict. I think what you would hope is that, as the situation progresses and new developments come about, like the announcement by Nissan and perhaps announcements by other companies, if they were to make such announcements, positive or negative, that people would change their views, and take on that information, update their view of the world and say, right, this is the way forward. Unfortunately, I don't think that we've really seen that perhaps over the last year or two within Westminster. I think instead we've seen two camps in very entrenched positions. They're not really sort of looking at the picture in terms of how it's developing. They're perhaps not thinking about the implications that this has in terms of the economy and sort of remain in their entrenched positions rather than coming together and trying to discuss matters. I'm not particularly hopeful that will change in the coming months, but of course that would be a very good outcome if it was to. And
one final question for you. As a Sunderland native, what's the future for your hometown, Paul?
Well, the city needs to, add another engine to its economy. Nissan has been a huge success story, creates lots of jobs, although, again, they have been fairly low-paid jobs. And that is a challenge for Sunderland, is that, yes, it's seen jobs growth over the last 20 or 30 years after its traditional industries closed down, but those jobs have tended to be fairly routinised and tended to be lower skilled. So it means that the city is constantly on this precipice of a new round of automation or a new round of globalisation, which does threaten jobs like the jobs in Nissan. And it needs to be, adding these extra engines, jobs growth in new areas, new industries that are going to create these higher paid type activities and put more money in people's pockets. And that's what both local government in Sunderland, but national government also needs to focus on in the coming months and years if the standard of living and people's lives are going to be better living in the city than what there is currently.
Paul Swinney of the Centre for Cities, thank you for joining us from the UK capital.